Welcome to the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary tip of the day. I'm Scotty B. In this limited series, we will be running between seasons to share your tips and thoughts on topics inside the industry and, of course, everything that can touch cosplay. So today's tip for Monday and for this week is going to be on podcasts and how making a podcast is easy. So we'll start there. There's not a whole lot to it like there used to be. There used to be a ton of problems with hosting and with coming up with just recording and all that stuff in general. But now it's super easy to do, and it's actually a lot more cheap to produce. So really the only two components that you need is something to host it on, and there are a number of sites that do not charge hardly anything depending on how much content that you want to put out. So I use Buzzsprout, and Buzzsprout, seriously, for a few hours a month for hosting space, they do not charge much, and the interface is very easy. You do not need a website. You do not need anything like professional equipment. You need something to record with, and you need some sort of editing software so that you can convert what you need to convert into a file that you can then download into that site. Everything else is very much plug and play, and really you can pair off what you do with a podcast with just about anything, and it's easy to do so. It's easy to share it out. It's easy to double your footprint online, and really you can even turn it into a transcript and make it into a blog, or vice versa. You can turn your blog into a podcast. Very simple to do, very easy to get a hold of a transcript and just start going. That is how these are going to go. This is a format that I would like to keep very quick, very easy, and very daily for you to tune into and listen to a tip and a thought. This week we'll be covering podcasts in general, and be sure to be here all this week for more tips. Tomorrow we will be talking about distribution and what to do and how all of that will fit together. So again, just a couple of minutes to go into podcasting, how easy it has become, going to any number of sites to be able to put that out there and get started on a podcast, which really is the blog of the now. So thanks again for tuning in. We'll be here all week to talk about more tips and thoughts on podcasting in general, and we'll have more content in weeks to come. This is Scotty B from Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary. Welcome to the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary tip of the day. This is Scotty B. This is a limited series running between Seasons 1 and Seasons 2 where we offer you tips and share out thoughts on topics inside and outside of the cosplay industry that just affect the things that you do and the content that you share. This week we're talking about podcasts. Yesterday's cast was about how easy it is to make a podcast, and today we're talking a little bit more about podcast distribution and setup. Once you have created a podcast, really let's talk a little bit about distribution and what that means. So when your podcast goes out, it actually increases your footprint online quite a bit. Not only do you have things in your social media space, and not only do you have just content-rich material and content that you can continue to put out into other spaces in your niche, which is possibly cosplay, possibly something else. These are just things that people will want to hear from you about, but it gets you onto Spotify, it gets you onto Stitcher, it gets you into iTunes, and it's very easy to be on those platforms with a podcast and then be able to crawl through those spaces as well and reach even more people. And you can tie all of that back into your following, and everything plays very well with everything else. It can feed into what you're doing. So the podcast is easy to share. Most programs that you'll use, again, the podcasting is easy. Most programs that you use will have a share feature so that it's very easy for you to distribute among social media platforms and just keep things going. Sound clips, by the way, might be a little bit of a trick if you're trying to share them out in stories and have other people share that clip out because of the issues that Instagram stories has with sound in general and the copywriting of that sound or those pieces. Keep in mind that the podcast and being able to share it and distribute it is just one piece of a larger self-branding puzzle. It will give you more rich content to share on all of your platforms, but it just becomes part of the mix, which is the important thing to know about podcasting in general as it pertains to cosplay. So that is where I will end it today. Tune in tomorrow and we will talk about how to create a podcast in a very visual industry like cosplay. Thanks for tuning in. Be sure to be here all week for more tips and thoughts on podcasting. This is Scotty B with Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary. Welcome to the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary tip of the day. This is Scotty B. This is a limited series that'll be running between Seasons 1 and Seasons 2. Be sure to pick it back up September 3rd when the next season comes out. In the meantime, we have tips and thoughts for you inside of the things that will affect you in the cosplay industry. This week, we're talking about podcasting in general. And today's topic is podcasting with cosplay in a very visual and very borrowed environment. Yes, when you're in cosplay, it is something that primarily benefits from having a camera because everybody wants to see your cosplay. So how on earth can you use podcasts to your advantage or benefit if it's just audio? Why would anybody want to listen to a podcast on cosplay when they can watch a video or they can go to Instagram and see all the pictures because it's very visual? Video is really actually quite difficult to be consistent with. You may disagree with me if you have a journalism background, but for the most part, creating at scale and consistently video content that can convert in spaces like YouTube, never mind the hosting issues that you will have if you are not on a free to upload platform like YouTube. It also takes a very long time to edit and upload videos. So creating a podcast, in addition to the other things that you do, can not only give you the forum for creating videos later, but it can also add to the mix of rich content that you add to all of your spaces online. So if you have a podcast, you can still record it, and then you can convert that into videos on other platforms. So you can add it to Vero, you can add it to IGTV, and you can add it to YouTube later. So my suggestion would be is if you do not want to do videos or that you don't want to consistently create video content, that you could use podcasts as a type of a filler, and actually a very inexpensive one, along the way in order to generate more quality and more content and add it to the mix of what you're already doing. You could take those subjects and content that you talk about, and then later on, you could create a video around things that you've already accumulated. So it gives you a bit of a runway, and it gives you things that work and things that don't work. Maybe you can gauge how you're engaging with the content that you've already created via podcast. It's relatively cheap and it's relatively easy, but it can be effective to show you what people would want to watch and what they want to listen to. And it can also gear you up if you're not somebody who has been on camera very much, if you're not somebody who's been on a microphone very often, that it gives you a little bit of a safer space to, instead of just jumping into the cold water with video and audio, that you can start to get into editing, and it's a relatively, again, cost-effective place for you to practice, for lack of a better term, on being camera ready and being able to communicate what you want with your audience through your videos online or in whatever format that you decide to do. But podcasting can always be part of that mix. So make sure that you check in tomorrow as we talk about collaborations with podcasting and how to set that up. This is Scotty B. Thanks so much for being here this week as we talk about the tips of the day, and I'll see you tomorrow. Welcome to the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary tip of the day. This is Scotty B. This is a limited series that will be running between seasons to offer you tips and share out thoughts on the topics inside and surrounding the cosplay industry. Today, we're going to be talking about collaborations, how that will fit and enhance the podcast that you produce. So a lot of people think that creating a collaboration might be difficult, or that it wouldn't be something that really fits into a podcast, or they don't want to do a podcast because it isn't too interesting to them, but also they just don't want to talk to themselves for 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time to create the content and then push it out into the interwebs. Not only is making a podcast easy, but so is being a guest on a podcast. So let's say that you do not want to produce 100, 200, 300 podcasts as time goes on. You don't want to keep coming up with content of your own, but you are still in the cosplay space. You understand that there might be other people who are interested in that. So you can go and find podcasts that perhaps you could be a guest on, and you can do it all remotely from your house. It's very easy to set up on any number of platforms or programs that you can use, including Skype and Zoom, among others, that you can basically just remote in and you can do the podcast there. A lot of places also have studios where you can be involved in the podcast directly and interact with the recording in a studio itself. Coming up with 20 minutes of content in that space is actually a lot easier than you might think. Once you get through all of the little elements of a podcast, the introduction and the pitches and the station identification, if there is any, shouting out your sponsors, and then going through the outro, after you've asked a few questions and talked about the industry and talked about the stories behind some of the different things, and questions come up as you're talking to someone because it's conversational, that you very quickly can fill 20 minutes with not a ton of stress and strain and overthinking that you would possibly think is involved with creating all of this and producing it. It's actually a lot easier to produce a collaborated podcast than you might think, and it's also not too bad to be a guest. So make sure that the show is a good fit for you and that it is a subject that you want to talk about, or that subjects on that podcast, do your homework, are things that you've heard about and that you actually would enjoy being a part of. Not necessarily just one of those little career boosters or content makers, but that you've heard the cast, or at least you've listened to a few episodes and you've reached out and you've talked about that, and that it's something that both the person producing the podcast and the guest want, whichever side of that you happen to be on. There's also the matter of documentation, which isn't too hard to figure out. Just make sure that you have something that everybody agrees to, or that you agree to as far as the scope, and that the notes are presented, or that there's some form of organization so that you're not all stressed out about being a guest, or that it's just completely shot from the hip. That can be a little bit of a problem. Make sure you stay organized and you create that content that can lead to other things, that could lead to possibly you doing your own podcast, to being a guest on other shows, or to getting into video content. There are many doors that could be opened just from having that open mind and thinking, oh, well, maybe podcasts could work for me in some way. So we have one more for you this week, and it's going to be on the topic of studios and co-anchors. So I hope you join me tomorrow for one more tip on podcasts this week. This is Scotty B for Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary, giving you all the tips this week. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye. Welcome to the Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary tip of the day. This is Scotty B. This is a limited series that will be running between seasons to give you tips and share out thoughts on topics inside and affecting the cosplay industry. Today and this week we've been talking about podcasts, and today we will talk about studios and co-anchors as part of a podcast. What I know about podcasts is pretty much you can do them anywhere. You can do them in your own home if you have space. You can rent space for a podcast. You can have your own podcast studio. And I know that a lot of people are discouraged by creating the content or putting it out there in that shape or form because they don't think that they are enough, because they don't have a professionally produced space or professional atmosphere, or that they are not a professional DJ or radio personality themselves, that they would not be able to just talk for an hour, and they don't have the equipment, and they don't have this, and they don't have that. So there's a lot of things that people think that they need to have that they possibly do not. You really just need 3 to 5 minutes. The editing, guess what, probably doesn't take you much longer than that if that's all the longer your podcast goes. That is really the the minimal amount of time that this takes to put something together. And you don't actually need a studio. You just need something to record with that can create sound that isn't going to have a lot of background noise. So just make sure that you have like a quiet space wherever you happen to be. Even if it's in an apartment building in a busy neighborhood, you can still find time in your schedule and you can still find space where there isn't that much background noise. And honestly, it's not the biggest thing about the podcast. It's really the quality of the content and the information that you give that gives it the experience for your listener, not necessarily that it is in this soundproof, perfect looking room, because for the most part, they're going to be listening to what you're talking about, not what they're looking at in the background. Studios can be great depending on what you want to do with the recording. And of course, with a more professional cast, there can be different focus on your brand. There could be a different focus for that location and what the recording is really all about. All of that can be very expensive per produced minute. Having spots on radios is super expensive to do. You can spend thousands of dollars on very little and get very little out of that experience. If you know people, that's great. Go for it. But if you're just getting started, you don't actually need to go that crazy with creating a podcast. There's so many things you actually don't need to get started. A studio is definitely one of them. So the other part of that is your co-anchor and whether or not you actually want one or need one. I know a lot of people, again, they don't want to produce a podcast or be part of that unless there's somebody else there talking to them, and that's not a bad idea. Just make sure that the person that you're working with, it is mutually agreed to, whatever you have to get written down, however you're going to organize that you and your co-anchor are on the same page and you want to produce content that's good for both of you. The advantage to having a co-anchor is that you don't have to be present or active in every single cast. They can take over and they can do a few episodes, or you can be there together. You can interview guests together, so it takes a lot of the pressure off one or the other person. But in general, it is a little bit less pressure and it's a little bit more interactive because you know that person and you can create different kinds of content when you are working with a co-anchor versus doing it all on your own. You can also do it completely remotely if you have a co-anchor. There is no need to set up studio space when you have someone else working with you on a show, unless you really want to, that you can both basically just get on a call and record that, and the sound quality and everything is still going to be there. It's really just dependent on the type of equipment that you have. The medium for which you are recording generally is pretty standard. There are very cost-effective ways for you to record with that person, and you can even scale it up if you want to do different types of things with them in that space. Easy to do. So those are my tips for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in every day. Next week, we're going to have a completely different topic. We're going to get off of the podcasting and we're going to start talking to you more about e-commerce and how that fits into cosplay. So this is Scotty B with Heroes of Cosplay Sanctuary. Thanks for listening this week. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you again soon.